Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time, as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I want to look at a modern release, Resident Evil VII BioHazard. Now let's talk about the Resident Evil franchise for just a little bit. I've reviewed several games on my channel. I'm a big fan of the franchise, but for a while it started to veer toward action more heavily, starting with approximately Resident Evil 4, but maybe even Resident Evil 3 was starting to do that, and then Resident Evil 5 took it a step further, and Resident Evil 6 went full left field and focused exclusively on action and big set pieces, and kind of got away from the survival horror roots that the first few games established. And so people were a little skeptical about the series for a while, and it got put on ice outside of some spin-off titles. And then it was announced that Resident Evil 7 was coming, and there have been rumors that it was going to be first person. And that was an interesting idea, and people were excited and skeptical at the same time. They were excited because they assumed that this would mean a better focus on survival horror, but at the same time, Capcom had never really done first person for the Resident Evil franchise, outside of the main entries at least. You had things like the Umbrella Chronicles that were like on-rail shooter for the Wii, but outside of that, the mainline games were third person. So there was a lot of hope and a lot of skepticism. But when the first trailer started dropping and you saw the Baker family for the first time, I think everyone's fears were pretty much put to rest because it looked absolutely horrifying. And the demo came out, and people were going nuts, myself included. I was very excited about the prospect of Resident Evil 7 and what it could mean for the franchise. This was essentially a soft reboot of the series, or maybe even a hard reboot in a lot of ways, with a brand new protagonist, a new setting, and an entirely new antagonist as well. We saw the defeat of Albert Wesker in Resident Evil 5, so we had a new antagonist going forward here in Resident Evil 7. So it starts off with you as Ethan Winters, who goes to this house where his wife has been staying with his family, and he's going to go and see if he can save her because she's been missing for a while. The letter's stopped, and he's got some like word of her, and so he's going to their house to try and find her because something has gone awry. And he goes in, and it's a mess. It's dark. It's really claustrophobic for a very long time. It's quite terrifying how the game is set up. And you actually find her really early on in the story, and she immediately goes insane on you and cuts off your arm. And that is the introduction that everyone was left with Resident Evil 7. A perfect way to bring the series back. This was a terrifying example of horror in this genre. They showed like full body horror out the gate, and it was really fantastic. I was really hooked immediately. What also set it apart was its focus on more like a supernatural element. After getting your arm cut off, you find some medicine that you put on your arm, and you shove the arm back on, and it like glues back together. It's super strange. And again, it happens later on when you get your leg chopped off, and you just pour some medicine on it, and you stick the leg back on, and no harm, no foul. It's quite fantastical, and I like that kind of element to this story because now we've got the supernatural element, whereas we didn't see that nearly as much in the other games. It was more just like straight monsters that you had to fight. But this looked to be something different, and it was a very unique experience from start to finish. And that's what I have to praise Resident Evil 7 on more than anything else, is its undying devotion to survival horror. It does not deviate from that from the beginning of the game all the way to the end. There are some pieces that were a little more action oriented, but that's normal for the Resident Evil franchise, even for the older games. There's some sections where you just do need to be using your weaponry more often, especially like boss fights and such. But this game really does not relent on the horror aspect of things. You have really tight liminal spaces that you have to go through in this house. It's contained on the Baker property. So you have like the Baker mansion, you have the Baker house, and to kind of like a parallel to the Spencer mansion, the original games. And then you've got like some outside property that you can go explore, but for the most, and like a little thing on like a bayou. There isn't much else though. You don't have a ton of space to be going around. As soon as you get into these places, they are tight quarters and very terrifying. You have a new enemy variety as well called the Mold, which are pretty terrifying at first. After a while, they get a little samey, and that's my only real criticism of this game, is that the enemy variety is not very present. The Mold, you see one version of it, and it looks the same no matter how many variants you get. They look slightly different, they do different things, but for the most part, that's the only enemy you get. You don't get zombies, you don't get the Ganados in Resident Evil 4 with the Las Plagas virus. It's an entirely new thing. I think it works for a while and then gets a little samey. But outside of that, the Baker family are the real stars of this show. So they have you strapped to a table at one point. You see this disgusting dinner that they've prepared for you that's all rotting and awful. You've got Jack, the head of the family. You've got Marguerite, the wife. And you've got Lucas and Zoe as the children. And they're all insane. You can tell right away they're out of their minds. And they try and force feed you. They're hurting you. You're strapped to this chair, and as soon as you get away, Jack starts pursuing you. Now, I think that Resident Evil 7 nails the pursuit mechanic better than any other game, including Nemesis and Mr. X from Resident Evil 2. They took that concept and put it back into this game in full force. Jack pursues you most of the game, and he is absolutely terrifying. He is a force to be reckoned with. You start running through the house as quickly as you can. You are injured immediately, so you don't have much speed. You have to be really smart with how you get away from Jack. But there are certain things that he can do to circumvent what you're doing to avoid him. He can burst through the wall. He can, in various places, he'll just break through, and you don't see it coming. You think you've outsmarted him, you've outmaneuvered him, and suddenly he's made a new path, and you have to turn around and run back the other way. He is absolutely terrifying from start to finish, really. Until you actually get rid of Jack, he is a terrifying presence that you never know if he's going to be lurking around the corner or not. Even after you kill him, you actually kill him several times, but he keeps coming back. Usually as Jack, later on as a mutated form, he gets a little bit bigger, a little bit similar to Nemesis in Resident Evil 3, but to a lesser degree. He transforms, but not before pursuing you for a big chunk of the game. So he is the main star of the show, the real horror that is the Baker family. But he's not the only one. There's several jump scares that are scripted that will absolutely scare the pants off of you. Or you're in a tight space and suddenly something jumps out and grabs you. One of the other Baker family, Marguerite especially, she terrified me the entire game. She was really scary, especially in her section when you have her boss fight. She was not only scary with tons of jump scares, when you actually get to fight her, she becomes really, really creepy. Her body shifts and breaks and her arms become longer and she starts crawling around like a spider. And then you have to, oh my goodness, there's so much horror in the way she skulks around, and then in her body shape too, and how you have to fight her. It's really disgusting. They really nailed that element so well. It's almost like gross just thinking about the fight with Marguerite, because she was actually so terrifying. Throughout the story, you're trying to save your wife, you're trying to get her away from the Baker family, and figure out what's wrong with her. You find out that this mold presence is what's been causing everything, and there's some twists and turns throughout the story that are actually so fantastic. The reboot of this game and an emphasis on this new mechanic and this new family really pays dividends in a lot of ways. It gives us a new level to explore in terms of lore, and it ultimately succeeds on every front. I think the story from start to finish is fantastic. One of the best in the series. And because it's so scary from start to finish and have such small spaces for you to explore, it really capitalizes on the void that was left in Resident Evil 6 after Resident Evil 6 dropped and we didn't have Resident Evil for a while. They came back in full force. They gave us something really special to bite into. It's terrifying. The boss fights are really fantastic. The gunplay is really good. They actually added a new blocking mechanic as well. Because you're in first person, maneuverability isn't nearly as good as something like a third person perspective, so they gave you the ability to block, just throw up your hands and take some damage but less damage. That way you have to be more strategic about how you mitigate damage, or if you can't run away, you need to make sure that you're blocking. And you have to utilize your weapon really, really well. The way that they implement survival is perfect in this game. I was rationing my ammo from start to finish, and there were still times where I was a little bit short and had to utilize my knife. And learning like the movements of the enemies and the tactics that they employ to get good knife swipes off is imperative for this game. And I love that they never relent on that survival aspect. This is a survival horror experience the entire way through, with some fantastic boss fights. Even later on when the boss fights get bigger and scarier and you have to use your weaponry and actually have a full-on action sequence, it feels earned. And that's what I love about this game. The story ultimately pays off. There's a great conclusion, and some nice cameo from Chris Redfield at the very end of the game to kind of tie it back into the Resident Evil universe and reintroduce him as not a boulder punching piece of work, but instead as someone looking to save Ethan and his family. I love Resident Evil 7. I think it's a fantastic horror experience. And because it did something brand new for the series, because of this first-person perspective that ultimately really pays off, I have no other recourse but to give Resident Evil 7 a platinum rank. I love this game. I'm excited to go back and play it again. I intend to do so very soon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.